For centuries, it's felt like there's this huge battle going on in our culture. You've got the logical, data-driven world of science on one side, and the creative, messy, human world of the arts on the other. But what if that whole division is just wrong? What if English literature isn't just a bunch of great stories, but the very thing that connects these two ways of understanding ourselves and our world? Okay, let's get into it. Now, you probably wouldn't expect a quote like this from E.O. Wilson. I mean, the guy was one of the absolute giants of modern biology. But this one sentence, it just perfectly captures the wild idea we're exploring today. Wilson was basically saying that when you get right down to it, real scientific breakthroughs and amazing artistic creation, they're not just compatible, they're two sides of the same coin. They both need that same spark of imagination. All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start with this old quest to try and unite all of human knowledge. Then we're going to look at a pretty bold and controversial attempt to use Darwin's science to understand novels. After that, we'll get into the big pushback against that idea, before we land on a much more balanced view. And finally, we'll see how this whole debate is exploding right now, with tech that can literally see what's happening in our brains when we read. So before we can talk about bridging the gap, we've got to understand just how deep that gap really is, a chasm that for decades has defined how we think about the world. So picture this. It's the 1950s. A physicist and novelist named C.P. Snow looks around and gives this problem a name. He calls it the two cultures. He saw the world of ideas splitting into two totally separate camps, the scientists over here and the literary folks over there, and they had basically stopped talking to each other. They had different languages, different rule books, and honestly, they just didn't get each other at all. And to fix this, E.O. Wilson comes in with this radical, massive idea, consilience. He imagined this grand unified theory of everything, where science could eventually explain all the other fields, from economics right down to Shakespeare. For Wilson, this wasn't about building a friendly bridge. It was more like a scientific takeover bid, bringing all human knowledge under one roof. It was a huge vision and, as we're about to see, a very controversial one. Now, this whole consilience thing wasn't just some theory people talked about in a university lounge. No, it led to a very specific, and let me tell you, a very heated attempt to put it all into practice. Which leads us to the million-dollar question. Can science actually explain Shakespeare? I mean, really? Could the same evolutionary forces that gave us thumbs and eyeballs also explain why Othello makes us feel what we feel? Could the secrets of our greatest stories really be found in our deep Stone Age past? And this is the core idea of a movement called literary Darwinism. The premise is actually pretty simple. Our modern skulls are housing a Stone Age brain. And because that brain evolved to solve very specific problems, like finding a mate, avoiding predators, the stories it loves to create and consume have to, in some way, be shaped by those ancient needs. But, it's not like everyone in this camp agreed. They kind of split off. You had the adaptationists who argued that telling stories was a crucial survival tool. It helped our ancestors cooperate and stick together. But then you had others, like the famous linguist Steven Pinker, who saw literature more as a byproduct, a beautiful but ultimately accidental result of other things we evolved, like complex language. So you can probably imagine, when a bunch of scientists tried to explain art, it caused a bit of an explosion in the humanities departments. The literary world, well, they push back hard. And here's the best part. One of the most brutal takedowns came not from an English professor, but from another superstar of biology, Stephen Jay Gould. He argued that these evolutionary explanations for culture were often just so stories. Like those old fables about how the camel got its hump. They sound plausible, they make for a good story, but you can't actually prove them. And the critiques got really specific. Literary scholars were like, okay, hold on. You guys are only talking about the plot, like who gets married in a Jane Austen novel, but you're totally ignoring the style, the language, the poetry, the stuff that actually makes it art. And they raised another great point. If you think storytelling is this amazing adaptation for social bonding, what about religion? It's older, it's way more common. Shouldn't that be your prime example? It felt like they were reducing all this complex art down to simple bedtime stories. But this story doesn't just end with a big academic food fight. Out of all that conflict, something way more interesting and way more useful started to emerge. People started talking about a second wave consilience. See, that first wave felt like a hostile takeover, a one-way street where science just drove down and explained everything else. This new model,
It's a real two-way street. It's a conversation, a partnership, where science and the humanities can actually learn from and even correct each other. The ideas can flow in both directions.
And check this out, there's a perfect historical example of this. Back in the 19th century, the greatest physicist alive, Lord Kelvin, did all the math and announced that the Earth was way too young for Darwin's theory of evolution to have happened. So physics was about to shut down biology. But Darwin's story, his evidence from the natural world, was just too powerful. It forced the physicists to go back and check their assumptions. And you know what? With the discovery of radioactivity, it turned out Darwin was right and Kelvin was wrong. A softer, more narrative science had actually corrected a hard mathematical one. So the takeaway here is huge. Science is amazing at explaining the how our brains process words, how a sad story triggers certain chemicals. But it often needs the humanities to help ask why. Why do we even tell these stories in the first place? Think about it. All of literature is like this massive data set on human nature, thousands of years of deep observation that can challenge a scientific theory. It gives us the context, the meaning, and the ethical questions to help us figure out what to do with all that data.
And this brings us right up to the present day, because this whole debate is no longer just academic. It's happening for real, right now, because of technology.
Welcome to the world of neuromarketing. We're talking about companies and researchers using hospital-grade technology, not to find diseases, but to figure out exactly what happens inside our brains when we watch an ad, or scroll through social media, or read a book. This is that scientific turn we talked about, but on steroids.
And the tools they're using are just mind-blowing. They use eye tracking to see the exact path your gaze takes across a web page. They hook people up to EEGs to measure their brain waves and see if they're actually engaged or just zoning out. They can even use fMRI scanners to watch the blood flow in your brain to see what parts light up, trying to predict what's going to be a bestseller. We have gotten to the point where we are, quite literally, reading the reader.
And this leaves us with one final and absolutely critical question. We are getting scary good at understanding the how of storytelling, how to engineer a book cover for maximum clicks or write a sentence that triggers just the right emotional response. But the better we get at the how, the more we risk forgetting to ask about the why. As science gives us the power to craft the perfect, most persuasive story imaginable, who gets to decide what that story is for? Is it to sell a product? Is it to build empathy? To challenge power? Science can build the perfect tool, but it can't tell us how we should use it. That question, well, that one's on us.